In this video, we're going to have a look at a start to finish edit using Lightroom 2021 and the new updates, just to see how far it can take us with the edit. So here we have Eilean Donan Castle, and this was captured recently on a trip on the way up to Skye. So you can see here the detail of the image, and that there at first I thought was the flag blowing in the wind, but as you can see it's a tiny bit of mist coming down from the hills. This is a 3-stitch panorama put together in Lightroom, and I've also taken out the people that were there, and I'll put that up on screen now. So as you can see, just remove the people just to give us a good starting point with this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work my way through this the way I would normally edit it, and then as I'm loving the new masking feature in Lightroom, I'm going to edit it with that. So the first thing I would do is I'll go into my basics and I'll try and balance out the image slightly. I'm quite happy with the exposure in this one, but I'm going to bring the highlights down a touch in the sky. The shadows, the way the image was captured, as you can see by the histogram, it's okay. It's a really good starting point. Not too bright a day, not too dull a day either. It's just been a good starting point for this. Go into the whites just to see where it's going to take us. Yep, too much there, so I'm just going to zero that back in. Blacks I'm not going to touch. Dehaze I don't really need to touch because that's going to affect the castle too much, but because we've got masks now, I can use the dehaze and then unhaze that when I get back into the masking. So I'm watching what I'm doing and I'm making the considerations of based on what I can now do with the masks. So I quite like the depth that that's brought in there, but at the same time I can use a mask to do that in the sky. So again, I'm going to leave that. Going to get into the tone curves next, and you'll notice that all my panels close down each time I use them. This is in here. If I just right click, I've got it in solo mode, and what I can do is I can customize the develop panel and move them all around, but the only one I have at the top is calibration. I've just moved that up to the top because the rest are set out in a certain order. But I'm working in solo mode on both panels so that everything collapses and keeps my screen nice and clean. And that wasn't meant to rhyme there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get into the tone curve, and I'm just going to use this again to balance out the image. And if you think of the RGB within that and how these colours interact with each other and create white light, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to use this instead of contrast. I'm going to use contrast later, but I'm going to work in RGB just now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into the reds and just ever so slightly bring everything down. I'm just going to create that small S curve that we're looking for, knowing that that there has added too much green, but knowing when I move on to the green, it's going to bring it back. And if I go into the green here, and I bring that back down, you'll notice more into the magenta, and it's just balancing out the colours within the image. So I'm going to keep my eye on the image and not the slider for this. Push that up, just about there, go into the blue. Warm that slightly, and I've hardly moved these because I've got a nice balance overall to the image, I think anyway. And I may actually just bring that over there a touch more. So that's me, I'm quite happy with that. I'll then go in and balance out the image again. So we're going to darken this down, lighten that up, and I may even play with the mids in here. Again, I'm looking at the overall image. I'm not just looking at certain areas for this, because as these panels work, these panels are global edits. The mask is when we have the fun with the image. Colour-wise, quite happy with it. I can deal with the blues in the mask, but to be honest, I'm going to deal with them here slightly, and I'm just going to push them to a +1, which I can type in instead of trying to use the slider there. And that gives me that in there and that in there. And with the yellows, I'm going to pull them back slightly because I know that will affect the greens there. Saturation, you'll see what I mean when I do that. I'm actually going to push the saturation because I quite like the image so far. Next, I'm going to get into the detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sharpen the image here. So I'm going to push that slightly, just to around 40, which was the default before. I'm then going to hold down Alt and I'm going to move the masking button. Now, if you're quite new to Lightroom, what's happening now is everything in white will be sharpened to the amount of 40. So I don't want too much sharpness in the clouds at all, but I do want some sharpness in the castle. Let me push that a bit further there and then just check it here. And again, I'm holding down Alt. If you hold down Alt when you're pushing the amount, you can see the difference there if you watch the castle here. I'll zoom in and show you this. So I'm holding down Alt and moving the amount button. This way you're seeing it in tones and how it actually sharpens the image. So if I push that too far, I'm going to get too many artifacts. So I'm just working around about here. Yep, quite happy with that. And that's at 60. Maybe take it up a bit further so that it doesn't over sharpen. So that's me. Quite happy where I'm sitting. I am going to go on to the edit and I'm going to go in and use the fun part of this. I absolutely love the new features in Lightroom 2021 or version 11. Just the control we have now. So this is found up here in the masks. I've already cropped this image to 16:9 and as you saw previously I've cleaned up in Photoshop because I don't think that Lightroom can do it as well as Photoshop for the cleanup and especially for removing the people. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to work from the sky right through the entire image. I'm going to base everything around the foreground in the sky. And by everything, I mean the castle and how that works. I have my panel set below. I just find it easier working this way because the rest of the panels are there instead of it popping out here. So what I'm going to do is select the sky. And this is how quick it is. And there we have the sky selected. Yes, it's went on to some of the background elements here. But to be honest, that isn't going to affect the outcome of what I'm looking for too much. But if I want to subtract from it, I can just click subtract. I can use a brush. The last time I was using the brush, I had the phone density up at 100, and I'll show that in another video, the reasons why I was doing that. And I'm going to create a nice feather here. So I'm just going to paint in here, and this will subtract some of this from the sky, so that when I go in for the edit, none or very slightly some of this will be affected. So there we go. I'm just going to go in there, I'm going to paint over again. I'm just being very careful with this, and I'm going to leave it at that for this so that you get the idea of it. There's the sky, which is the mask, and that is it overall in here. And when you click that, you'll notice that you have a compromised panel. And by compromised, I mean you can see it's not the basic panel. So if you're moving sliders and everything, make sure at the top it says effect and doesn't say basic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the exposure down here, just a touch. I can now start working with the contrast and the dehaze. Now I can push the dehaze too far. So I'm looking for subtleties in this, and there is actually quite fine for me. I'm going to bring the shadows down slightly. I'm going to over exaggerate each movement so that you can see where it's affecting. So I'm going to bring the shadows down slightly. Highlights, I brought them back at the beginning, but do I want to bring them back up? No. I actually want to bring them back down. My vision is I'm going to darken most of the sky, most of the foreground, and then lighten the castle itself so that it lifts out from it. So that's what I'm thinking, and that's the route I'm heading down with this. Clarity, not too bothered about. Dehaze I've already done. Saturation now, I can pull the saturation down or I can push the saturation. Now that entirely depends on what I'm going to do when I get to the castle itself. But again, because it's masks, I can jump back in and out and edit these to get for the final image. Quite happy with that. I'll call that mask sky. What I'm aiming to do now is I am aiming to edit the foreground. So to do that, I'm going to create a new mask. And what I'm going to do is select the sky again and let Lightroom do its thing, which you know is very, very quick, and select the sky. From here, I want the foreground. So I'm going to invert that, and that will select the foreground. In this case, it's including the castle and the mountains in the background here. Now, at the moment, I know I don't want to edit them along with the foreground, so I'm going to subtract some elements from this. And I may have to speed this part up, but what I'm going to use is the brush to subtract. So I'm going to click subtract, and I'm going to take the brush. And in this case, I'm going to pull the feather right back. And the flow is up at 100, and the density is up at 100, and auto mask is on. So if I paint on this, you should notice some of the foreground elements are disappearing now. I'm going to take my time with this and get this to where I want it, so I will speed up the video from this part. Now it's at this point where I'm working between the foreground and the midground, which is the subject of this, that I want the blend to be more subtle. And as I said, I had the feather at 0 and auto mask on, so it was picking up as everything it could. Now I want this blend to be subtle, so now what I'll do is I'll push that up to about 50, perhaps even further than 50, maybe about 95, which is quite a bit further than 50. And then just paint over this, and it's just simply so that the blend that I have between the foreground and the midground is softer. That's the reason I am doing this. So there we go for that. That's us, we're ready to edit the foreground now. Again, subtle edits. Exposure, I'm going to darken this slightly, because it is the foreground, not too much. That's probably enough, to be honest. That's minus 35. Any highlights in it, I'm going to take them down just now, just to see what happens. And as I said, I'm going to take the sliders both to the minus and then to the plus, so that you can see exactly where I am heading with this. The shadows I'm going to push ever so slightly, just for the foreground elements. It's lighting it up, so I've darkened it down in the exposure, and then I'm pushing everything the opposite way with this. Blacks I'm not going to touch. Clarity I'm not going to touch. Dehaze. Now if I pull the dehaze here, if I take it right up, you'll see what happens. It gives me that distinct line between the two, and I don't want that, because I've just spent the time editing it, and I don't want the image to change too much for this, but I want to have a decent change for the final. So if I just press Y, you can see the before and after there. There's not too much of a difference, but you can definitely see that that's been edited. So at the moment I'm quite happy. I'm now going to call this mask foreground. And that's me have the sky in the foreground. Now we'll get into the nitty gritty again of the castle. So let's see what Lightroom picks up as a subject. So I'm going to get into create new mask, and I am going to go select subject, just to see how Lightroom reads this. And it's picked up that as a subject. Now I'd like to add more to that. For example, I would like to add this, and I would like to take away some of this, but only want to take that away lightly. So what I'm going to do is get into the mask, and I'm going to add to it, and again with the brush. So I'll just take that down in size, and for me I'm going to take the feather right back, and I'm just going to paint in there. I'm just going to do that. Now I'm not too bothered about how accurate this is, to be honest, because I don't think when I come to edit this that will affect too much, because it's quite flat in that area. So we've just added that to it. Just on there, I'm not going to take down too much in there. I want to subtract from this as well, so I'm going to click subtract using brush. This time I'm going to take the flow down, and I'm going to take the density down. One of my videos, which I'll link somewhere on the screen, talks about how to understand density and flow in the brushes in Lightroom, so if you check that out, you'll know why I'm doing certain things with these sliders. I possibly will even take that further, and I'm going to increase that, And I'm just going to paint over this very lightly. Not too much at all. But the good thing about the masks, I can jump back in and edit it later if I don't like it. And I'm going to paint again over this. Now, speaking of density and flow, if my density set at 79, I could paint over this 100 times. It will never paint over a maximum of 79 in this case. So I want to blend that bit here even further. So I'm going to push that further. And I'm just going to do that. And you should see a slight change in here. Not too much. I just don't want that hard line. I'm going to increase the flow as well for this. And it is, I'm just trying to get rid of that hard line there so that we have a softer blend. If I just do that, I reckon I'll be okay with that. Now it's included this area here. So if I go back into the subtract, which I didn't notice at the beginning, and I'm going to keep my flow and my density up there, and I'm going to paint over this area. Right, let's see how we can push this. Now I've got show overlay on. I'm going to turn it off for this example so that you can see. So if you've been with me so far, you know that I am now on my third mask and I'm working on the castle itself. So let's just go in and push the exposure of this. And we're just trying to balance it out with what I've done to the foreground and the background. That there, quite happy. I've lifted that a wee bit. Shadows, I don't think I want to lift the shadows too much because you'll then end up with that and it looks as if it's going back to the first incarnation of HDR. So I'm just going to lift them ever so slightly. Again, it's all subtle edits. Contrast, I can play with the contrast in here, which will affect the colours. But again, for me, I don't want it in this image. So blacks and whites, I don't think there's too much there to play with the whites because I'm trying to lift it slightly. And I'll take it back to 0 because 0 looks as if it's the best it's going to be. Push the saturation just a touch and also the sharpness. And remember at the beginning, we've already sharpened this anyway. I'm just looking to give it that extra wee bit of punch. So I'm going to push the saturation slightly, and I mean slightly. Just to about there. Based on the image there, yep, it's still too much. So let's take the exposure back a wee bit. And I'm just going to drag that back to around about there. Happier with that. So that's me, I have that there, and I'm going to close this down. So what we've done here is we've pushed that image and lifted it slightly just using the masks. We started on it with the image on the left and just using a few global edits and then some local edits. We've pushed the image to that. Now I don't want to go too much further with this because I quite like the final effect. But the good thing with the masks is that I can jump back into them. From here, I could go in to the basics panel. So what I can do now is I can go in and push the exposure globally again and look at the entire image overall. And again, that's just plus 11 from what it was at the beginning. So we have that there. I can get back into the masks if I want to darken the sky slightly. I can go into the sky and I can pull this back even further. But just a touch just to create depth. Because basically what we're trying to do is create the 3D depth again from a 2D image. Couple more things I can do with this. I'm quite happy as that image sits there. For me, that's quite sweet. It's not been too over processed. It's not too under processed. So there's a couple of things I want to do. So I want to darken this area here and this area here. Just a touch. Now I can get and create a new mask in this. And this time, because I'm just trying to work with it just a touch and be as precise as I possibly can to get that 3D effect, I'm going to create a new mask and I'm going to click the proper button and click create, and I'm going to use the brush. And this time I have my flow and my density all set. I'm just going to take them back slightly. The feather is there and I'm going to paint in that area there. just here, and I'm just going to take my time and paint around this and then basically colour it in. And that's normally how I work. I'll get my edges first and then colour in after that. And I'm going to do the same with this face here. Now, I'm not trying to add shadows where there weren't any shadows. It was, as you notice, quite flat in the image. But what I'm going to do is just try and bring out a tiny bit of depth in here. Now, I may do this in stages. So if I bring back the exposure here, just that, -11. That looks okay because, as you can see, the sun is over to my left when the image was taken. You can tell that by where it is. So I've got certain areas in here that I want to do. I'm going to add another mask. I quite like that -11, create new mask. So, but before I do that, let's name that. And we'll call this side 1. And we better name this, and we will name this castle. I was just trying to get into the habit of that. So above side 1, I'm going to create a new mask, and again a brush, just a tiny bit, and just in there. Now when I'm doing this, I painted that there with the flow and the density at 69. If I want an even more subtle effect, I'm just going to step that back. So I'm going to have to get in and create a new mask. I'm going to go brush, and I'm going to take the flow and density right down, roughly there. Purposes of this video. So you'll see there's hardly an effect here. I'm not overpainting, because if I overpaint, the maximum I can go to is 43. And then I'm going to increase the brush size. Auto mask is always on, and I'm just going to paint over that. And with any luck and auto mask being on, it won't jump into my sky. And there you go. Let's just paint down here a tiny bit as well, not too much. Now let's turn the mask off so that you can see what's happening here. I'm just going to bring the exposure back. See, I can go like this and turn it right down. And you'll notice I'm at -4 now, but it's hardly affecting it. Whereas that one there at -11, you could definitely see the effect in that. And if I just hide that, you can see the difference there straight away, or I can on this screen. But what I'm doing here, if I zoom out, perhaps you'll see a bigger difference. So we do that. I'll bring it in a tiny bit. If I drop that back, you may see the difference there. So I'm going to bring that one back just to around -85, and that was controlled by the way I painted it, using the masks, not by how much I'm pulling it back here in the exposure slider. I only applied it with a subtle flow and a subtle density. So hopefully you've got something from that. I just wanted to show you an approach to editing an image. This one I haven't taken too far, and I've left everything there. I wanted it to be quite a subtle edit for this one. I could have taken, there's plenty of potential in that sky, for example, but the potential is there to overdo it as well. If you notice these clouds here, if I take the dehaze up even further, I can do that, and it creates slight more drama in the sky. I can also warm them up slightly in the sky so that it takes and complements here. There is plenty you can do with this image, and that's the great thing about the masks. You can keep going back in and back in and back in and taking it to the point that you want to see, because it's your image. So there we go. I'm going to leave it at that. This is the final image that I'm quite happy with. By no means is it a portfolio piece in any way at all, but it's interesting to look at the different ways in which the new version of Lightroom tackles things, and how, as a photographer and editor, you can approach the subject as well. If you've enjoyed this video and you want to check out other videos on the channel, and perhaps after that consider subscribing, that would be greatly appreciated. If you've enjoyed the video, big thumbs up, because that really helps the YouTube algorithm as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.